$45 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund, supporting our state, local, and tribal leaders. $27 billion for the development of vaccines, therapies, and other public health response efforts, including $16 billion to build up the strategic national stockpile with critical stockpiles. And we have tremendous supplies coming into the stockpile, and you'll be seeing that and hearing about it a little bit because we're doing a news conference at 5:30 on what's happening. We've had tremendous results on the respirators. We've had great results on just about everything we're talking about. Boeing just announced that they're going to be making the plastic face shields, the actual shields, which are hard to come by, and they're going to be making them by the thousands a week. And the ventilators, which is probably the most difficult because it's like building a car. We will be announcing thousands are going to be built, and we have them under contract, and we have fast deliveries. As you know, we delivered thousands to New York, and unfortunately, they were delivered to a warehouse, which was good. Unfortunately, they didn't take them, but now they're taking them. New York is now taking them and redistributing them around the areas that they need. So you have also $3.5 billion to states to expand child care benefits for healthcare workers, first responders, and others on the front lines of this crisis, and $1 billion for securing supplies under the Defense Protection Act. And as you know, I've enacted the act. We've used it 3 or 4 times. I pulled it back 3 times because the companies came through in the end. They didn't need the act. It's been great leverage. I have instituted it against General Electric. We thought we had a deal for 40,000 ventilators, and all of a sudden the 40,000 came down to 6,000. And then they talked about a higher price than we were discussing, so I didn't like it. So we did activate it with respect to General Motors, and hopefully maybe we won't even need the full activation. We'll find out. But we need the ventilators.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.